When we think about the origins of humanity, we cannot help but go back to the beginning, to Adam and Eve, the first human beings created by God. They lived in a perfect paradise, the Garden of Eden, a place where suffering and death did not exist. But their disobedience marked a before and after. After eating the forbidden fruit, they were expelled from Eden, forced to face the consequences of their decisions, a world full of hard work, pain, and challenges. This is where life outside of paradise began. In this new stage, Adam and Eve started a family, and their first son was Cain. We can imagine the emotion they must have felt when they saw the birth of the first human life outside of Eden. Cain, as the firstborn, inherited the responsibility of working the land, a task that surely constantly reminded him of the curse that God had imposed on his father. With toil you shall eat from it all the days of your life. After Cain came Abel, his younger brother. Unlike his brother, Abel did not cultivate the land. He was a shepherd. He looked after flocks. Their roles were not coincidental, but a reflection of the needs and opportunities of that time. One worked the land, the other looked after animals. But from the beginning, these roles deeply differentiated them, not only in their occupations, but also in their character and, eventually, in their destiny. The relationship between the brothers seemed, at least on the surface, calm, but in their hearts, the seed of rivalry was latent, and soon an everyday act, offering sacrifices to God, would unleash a conflict that would change history forever. What happened next? Stay to find out. Subscribe to our channel and let's learn together from epically told biblical stories. In the course of their lives, the time came when Cain and Abel decided to offer sacrifices to God. This act was a form of worship, a show of gratitude and dependence on the Creator. However, what should have been a moment of devotion ended up being the starting point of a tragedy. Cain, the farmer, offered the fruits of the earth as a sacrifice. Abel, the shepherd, on the other hand, presented the best of his flock, the first and choicest offspring. Seeing these sacrifices, God accepted Abel's offering with pleasure, but rejected Cain's. This rejection marked a crucial difference between the two brothers. Why did God respond so differently? Many scholars suggest that it was not just a matter of what was offered, but how it was offered. Abel gave his best, with an attitude of humility and reverence. Cain, on the other hand, seems to have presented his offering without the same sincerity or commitment. God's rejection sparked something dark in Cain's heart. Envy and resentment began to consume him. Why was Abel, his younger brother, worthy of divine approval, while he, the firstborn, was not? That wound in his pride soon turned into deep contempt, and instead of reflecting on his own attitude, Cain focused his rage on Abel, as if he were to blame for his failure. God, in his mercy, did not ignore what was happening in Cain's heart. He spoke to him, warning him of the danger he faced. If you do good, will you not be accepted? But if you do not do good, sin is at the door. It desires you, but you must master it. It was a clear and direct warning. God was offering him a chance to correct his path, but Cain's internal struggle was too great. As his frustration grew, Cain had to make a choice: master this sin that was knocking at his door, or let himself be consumed by it. What he chose would mark the beginning of an unprecedented tragedy. What would Cain do with this hatred that now burned within him? God recognized that Cain was struggling internally, that envy and resentment toward Abel were consuming him. But he also gave him clear advice. Sin was lurking, like a predator stalking its prey. Yet Cain had the power to overpower it, to take control of his emotions and decide on a better path. At this critical moment, the choice was entirely in his hands. But that internal struggle was not easy for Cain. Instead of reflecting and accepting responsibility for his actions, he allowed resentment to take hold of his heart. The idea that Abel had been accepted while he was rejected seemed like a personal affront he could not bear. His wounded pride, combined with an inability to manage his emotions, led him to ignore God's warning. Instead of seeing the situation as an opportunity to improve, Cain let anger fuel a dark, uncontrollable desire. That internal battle between good and evil was the same one his parents, Adam and Eve, had faced in Eden. Like them, Cain made a wrong choice. Instead of mastering sin, he chose to be mastered by it. With each passing moment, envy grew, transforming into a visceral hatred of Abel, his own brother. It was as if God's warning had fallen on deaf ears. Cain had already made a decision in his heart, and the weight of that choice was leading him down a path of no return. The question was not whether he would act, but when and how. Thus, Cain's internal struggle was about to culminate in a tragic action that would change the course of human history forever. Cain's envy had grown like an unstoppable shadow, and in his heart he had already made the decision to act. But hatred rarely manifests itself directly. Instead of facing his frustration with honesty, Cain opted for deception. One day, Cain approached Abel with a seemingly innocent proposal. He invited him to the field, perhaps under the guise of a brotherly chat, or perhaps to ask for help with some task. Abel, trusting and without malice, accepted the invitation. The field represented the perfect place to execute his plan. It was a remote, silent space, without witnesses. There, surrounded only by nature and the land they both worked, the unthinkable happened. Cain, dominated by anger and resentment, attacked Abel and killed him. It was the first murder in the history of humanity, a crime that broke not only the bonds of brotherhood, but the fragile balance between human beings and creation. Specific details of how the act occurred are not mentioned, but we can imagine the coldness of that moment. The land that both brothers shared, the one that should have been a source of life and sustenance, was now stained with Abel's blood. His life was taken by his own brother, someone who should have protected and loved him. At this point, not only did Abel lose his life, Cain also fell. Although he was still alive, his act separated him from God and his family in an irreparable way. Envy and hatred had led him to commit a sin that could not be undone, and with each passing second after the murder, the consequences of his action began to weigh on him. The murder of Abel marked a dark moment in human history, the first time that sin took the form of lethal violence. But this was not the end of the story. Although Cain believed he could hide what he had done, God was watching. The earth itself, soaked with Abel's blood, cried out for justice. After the murder of Abel, Cain believed that his act would be buried in the silence of the field. But divine justice does not stop at deception or the attempt to hide the truth. It was then that God presented himself to Cain with a direct and disconcerting question. "Where is your brother Abel?" Cain's response was cold, almost defiant. Instead of repenting or confessing, he replied, "Am I my brother's keeper?" These words, full of cynicism, showed a hardened heart, unable to accept the gravity of his crime. But God already knew the truth. The very earth, stained with Abel's blood, cried out for justice. It was at this moment that God pronounced his judgment on Cain. His punishment would be severe, but also just. God cursed the ground beneath Cain's feet so that it would never again bear fruit, no matter how hard he worked. This condemned him to a life of wandering, homeless, and unstable, a fugitive from divine justice. Faced with this sentence, Cain finally showed fear. He exclaimed, "My punishment is greater than I can bear. Whoever finds me will kill me." Although he had shown little empathy for his brother, he now feared for his own life. But even in the midst of judgment, God showed mercy. To protect him, he put a mark on Cain, a sign that would warn anyone who tried to kill him that they would suffer divine vengeance. Thus, Cain was cast out to wander the earth, carrying with him not only the physical mark, but also the weight of his sin and his separation from God. His story does not end with his death, but with his legacy, an eternal lesson about the consequences of envy, hatred, and uncontrolled sin. The story of Cain and Abel is not only a tale of judgment, but also a warning to all of us. It reminds us how devastating it can be to allow dark emotions like envy and resentment to take control of our lives. But it also shows us that even in the midst of sin and punishment, God extends his mercy, offering opportunities for repentance. In the end, this story is not just about Cain and Abel. It is a mirror that invites us to reflect on our own internal struggles and our daily decisions. What do we do when sin knocks on our door? Do we master it or let it master us? The answer to that question defines who we are and what we leave behind as a legacy. In conclusion, the story of Cain and Abel is much more than an ancient tale. It is a powerful reminder of the internal struggles we all face. It tells us about the consequences of giving in to sin, but also about the weight of our decisions and the mercy that can exist even in the midst of judgment. This tragedy invites us to reflect on our own humanity and how we choose to handle the emotions that consume us. What does this story really teach us in our daily lives? Can we learn from Cain and choose a different path? If you are interested in exploring more stories like this and discovering the teachings behind the most impactful stories in the Bible, be sure to subscribe to my channel. Hit the bell to not miss any video, and let me know in the comments what you think about this story. See you in the next video. God bless you.